Thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. Whether you're a long-standing fan of ours or a newcomer to what we do, please do visit the website fantasy-animation.org and take part in the conversations we're having. Either leave us a comment on your favourite blog post, engage with the debates or discussions that our editorial think pieces raise, send over some suggestions for future episodes of the podcast that you'd like to hear, or you can even give us a star rating or a like and a bit of feedback on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It's all useful stuff and we really value the contributions of our listeners. If you're thinking of pitching an idea for a future blog post, however tentative or developed an idea, then we'd also love to hear from you. You can again visit the website, click on the submissions tab and find the submit form drop down. You can also take a look at our new team of editors that cover everything we publish, both traditional and non-traditional, from film, TV and event reviews to more reflective work by creative practitioners. They're ready and waiting to see what you've got. You can, of course, also email us at fanandresearch@gmail.com, or for more general inquiries or interests in how to get involved, use the Contact Us tab on the website too. But for now, please do enjoy the show.
Holidays are coming, holidays are coming, holidays are coming, holidays are coming, holidays are coming. 'Tis the season, watch out.
Hello listeners, welcome back to another festive edition of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I am, of course, Alex Sargent.
And I'm still, of course, Chris Holliday.
It's our Christmas special, suggested by listeners, and we had loads of great suggestions, more of which will be coming up in the show later. But we decided to go with Christmas adverts. So this is a show about Christmas adverts in general, some of our favourite examples of, and more sort of most noteworthy examples of Christmas adverts throughout the ages, and perhaps we'll get into conversations about the relationship between Christmas, fantasy, advertising, and animation. Lots of keywords there for us to unpack, Chris.
Yeah, and also I would say this is unusual for us because it's a Christmas special that we didn't record in like July. It's actually December. It's actually December.
Only
Yep.
just, but it is December. Yeah.
So I think we are allowed, and this is, we are allowed to sort of start talking about Christmas officially because I've seen decorations up, there are lights up outside, so this is unusual for us, a Christmas special actually recorded seasonally. So there we go.
To help us unpack this topic, we have a very special guest on the podcast. We have Dr. Malcolm Cook, who is an associate professor at the University of Southampton. Malcolm has published on a range of issues surrounding animation from various historical eras. His book, Early British Animation, came out a couple of years ago. And he is also the co-editor of Animation and Advertising with Kirsten Thompson, who is a previous guest on the show back in our SCMS special. So who better to have on the podcast to chat to us about the Christmas advertising bonanza? Malcolm, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, thanks, Malcolm. So I guess we'll kick things off with the obvious question. What is, or what do you find interesting about the relationship between animation and advertising?
I think there's lots of things here, but the key thing for me is this has been a central relationship throughout animation history, yet we've largely ignored it when writing animation histories or thinking about it. Animators have always worked on advertising. It's often provided a source of income while they were working on other animation films. Companies have often grasped animation because it has particular qualities that we'll maybe talk about later that can embody brands, embody products, and help convince people that they want to buy something or behave in a particular way. And if we look throughout animation history, it's actually quite hard to find any animator, any studio who hasn't been involved in advertising. And yet, if you look at the histories, it's rarely talked about. We've emphasized the importance of art or entertainment in animation history. But if you look at the history of Disney, of Pixar, of key figures like Lotte Reiniger, who we'll talk about in a moment, or Oscar Fischinger, any famous animator, they probably have created advertising at some point. And I think without thinking about advertising, we're not really thinking about the full history of animation. Likewise, I think it shows how important animation is to the wider world and the shape it's given to the 20th century, that it's not just a niche art form, that actually it's hard to think of the 20th century without animation and advertising being together. And of course, at Christmas time, that's especially the case. And again, we'll talk more about why that is. But I think there's particular things about animation that mean it's especially festive, that people want to watch this at Christmas. And that's why advertisers would grasp animation as a great way to create their Christmas adverts.
I was rereading the introduction to your animation and advertising book, and I was kind of jotting things down, and yeah, the sort of, I hadn't realised that there are so many animation studios, pioneers from kind of Europe and beyond that are involved in advertising. And so I was thinking, okay, so why is this? Is it just, I know in some cases and some kind of case studies, I guess it's to do with needing income at a particularly important, perhaps early moment in their career, or also is it kind of just exposure? Is it both? Like, in your research and sort of work with animation and advertising, it's clear that you can kind of you can create an alternate animation history entirely using adverts, presumably. And so I just wondered, was this because of income, and animators sort of needed money in the early stages of their career? Is it sort of established animators turning to advertising later in their career? How does that kind of work? Is it kind of economics or exposure, or is it both?
I mean, those are, of course, important, and I think that's how it often gets started. One of the things we've found exploring it is actually advertising precedes animation, and immediately that animation, as we would call it now, you get used as a term back in the 1910s or 20s. Immediately there, animated advertising is helping form what animation is. That advertisers are going and saying, look, we need something that's different from the live action feature films that we're showing on screen, because audiences, in some cases, certainly in Britain, for example, don't want to get confused. They need to be able to see, this is the main feature that we're paying for, this is just some extra item. Equally, it needs to be entertaining and enjoyable for those audiences, rather than seeming like an imposition. I mean, we often think of advertising as an imposition, a pain, whether it's pop-ups on websites or trailers and things at the cinema that are getting in the way of the thing we want to. And animation becomes a way of assuaging those problems for audiences, that actually we're happy to watch these films. They're entertaining, they're short. We don't mistake them for anything else. Their selling power is clearly evident. I mean, that's not always the case. Some other kinds of animated advertising hides the product message. If you watch George Pal's 1930s stop motion adverts for Horlicks, for example, they are like little cartoons that you wouldn't even realize was an advert until towards the end, where Horlicks comes down and Deus Ex Machina solves the problem that the characters have been having. So there's always different approaches, but I think it's especially the case that advertising shaped animation history so much that they're enmeshed. So we go beyond just, yes, of course it provided some income, but also it's shaped what we think of as animation. Anthropomorphism, for example, that I'm sure we'll come back to later. I think there was a tendency to emphasize that aspect of animation because it fulfilled advertising qualities. It's not just the other histories we know already.
It's interesting. I thought because you've given us a couple of adverts, about 5 of them to watch through, 5 or 6, isn't it? And we're going to talk about those sort of one by one in a few minutes. And as I was watching them, I thought my role on this episode was going to be to sort of just, make the note of the kind of obvious fantasy genre trope. So I was expecting to see Father Christmas. I was expecting to see some elves. I was expecting to see, the sort of the standard iconography of Christmas, because it's quite a fantastical time of the year, and there's something kind of fun about the sort of invitation to imagine that Christmas offers up to sort of pop culture. But I actually ended up thinking a lot more about sort of the relationship between the act of fantasizing and the act of desire. And there's been a lot of sort of theorists who talk about this, who I might weave as we continue the conversation. But it struck me that, of course, one of the things that advertising must do, or at least in some implicit way, is evoke the desire of the assumed spectator. And there's a whole thorny history of sort of the politics of desire in relationship to fantasy theory, because of course desire can be both a very radical and subversive emotion, because it can show us things we don't have and should want or might want to want in a world that isn't a world that could be rather than a world that is, and there's something ideologically in flux about desire. But also desire can be, if used in another way, quite conservative and sort of affirm power structures as they are. So I've got a lot to say about sort of how these different individual examples evoke or don't evoke or implicitly evoke or deal with the issue of desire through the way they sort of play with their products and the animation advertising. And I just like, so is there, I guess the question to ask you, Malcolm, after all that nonsense is what, like, is there something about the very sort of nature of what an advert is on a sort of ontological or essential level that you think kind of seems to require us to turn to animation? Because there's something about the acted advertising that feels a little bit beyond the live action and beyond the sort of everyday that animation's so good at doing. There you go. That's my impossible question. With 10 minutes in, I've done it. I'll retire now.
I mean, you've come to the wrong person if you want ontological essentialisms. I'm always historical specificity. Thank you. I mean, you're not wrong. I think there's a lot there. One thing I would point out is the adverts I've chosen, and maybe Christmas adverts emphasize a particular aspect of animated advertising. There's a whole other genre here, which we're not really getting into, which is the more factual, the information-based. Advertising can be there to inform, to help us understand choices we're making. And often animation can do that. It's a diagrammatic forms. That's not going to be something we talk about today, though. That Christmas adverts are all about that side, the side you've highlighted, which is desire, imagination, the possibilities, and especially the idea of brands rather than products. You know, we're if advertising's core function is to sell stuff, nevertheless, it sells stuff often by doing that through ideas and through, you know, what would be called brands in that industry. That you're trying to communicate particular qualities of something rather than just say, buy this product, it's cheap, it tastes good, or it does something useful. You know, there are lots of those adverts out there, but when animation gets involved, it often is on that other more emotive, more conceptual side of things. And even where adverts are factually based, they're often then using the animation to get the emotive aspect, to make an engagement with the audience. If you think of Aardman, of course, very famously continue to make lots of adverts, the Cuprinol Man or something like that, or the Lurpak Butterman, even where those products are pretty basic products, there's not much to sell or branding involved in one sense. The animation aspect of those adverts is all about engaging us with something that's actually quite basic, does a function, we need it, we need to buy it, but then the animation is the thing that makes us feel like, I want Cuprinol, I want Lurpak butter, I don't just want own brand essential value butter, I need Lurpak. Are we allowed to mention brands here?
Yeah, I reckon.
Yeah, other brands are available. But I guess I mean, yeah, certainly I know from your work, more broadly on sort of useful animation, because I was right. I know that you work on useful animation and animation in ulterior sorts of contexts, and it's certainly clear from reading your work there. In fact, the relationship between animation and advertising is so entwined, you might want to consider putting a slash between them. You know, that's how close and reciprocal they are.
What all the cool kids are doing.
Yeah, that is what all the cool kids are doing. But obviously, yeah, animated media, form, style, as you say in the introduction, your and Kirsten Thompson's introduction, that it's sort of shaped. Animation is shaped by these intersections with the animation industry, and it's part of this reciprocal give and take relationship animation gives to advertising. Advertising perhaps shapes the direction of certain kinds of studios and forms and styles and so forth, and some of the names in the introduction that you mentioned actually earlier on, from Disney to kind of Pixar and Lotte Reiniger and Emil Cole and J. Stuart Blackton, and what struck me actually, it was interesting that you sort of created two chronologies in your introduction to the book, and that sort of actually mapped quite nicely onto the selection of adverts that you gave us. Some involve sort of existing media properties moved into the advertising sphere, and others seem sort of, you know, quote unquote original. And so I was trying to get a sense, and there are two sort of historical timelines, it seems. There's sort of the aims of or the animation and advertising as understood through these sorts of key figures, and then there's kind of a second one that's you talk a little bit about that's more kind of hidden, that there are people who aren't Disney and Pixar, but who are making animated adverts that have been kind of sidelined. So is it that there's this sort of nice? It struck me that there was this sort of dual chronology or dual history. There's one famous and one not so famous in the way that we understand animation and advertising.
Definitely, that's part of the appeal. Is you've got this whole other history that's just completely ignored, and it's often not one based around studios and artists. I mean, animation's often thought about as an artist's form, and of course, lots of examples are created by individuals. And we'll see. I've got a Lotte Reiniger example here, so that clearly fits into her oeuvre and authorship style. But lots of the others, I don't know who made them, really. I haven't really investigated that. That's not, to me, what's especially interesting. They're authored by the brands, if you like. They're everyone will recognize the brands they're selling, and that the sort of authorial style is subordinated to this other purpose. Now, sometimes that's why we've ignored them, because people, especially academics, don't want to be any part of capitalism. They don't want to seem to be celebrating any aspect of it. And there's certainly an appeal of critique in discussing this topic, that you're engaging with the way the world is and the organization, the political economy. But equally, we're looking at the way we understand the world through these brands and through their organization of the world, rather than as something outside of the world, something that looks in. We're all embedded in this system, and if we ignore it, we're ignoring some of the key functions that animation serves, some of which may not be ones people want to celebrate, I guess, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't study them.
I think that's probably a good moment to move on to our first of the adverts you've selected for us to watch, Malcolm. And I had a lovely afternoon watching these, so I'm thinking of changing the format to fancy animation / advertising, but we'll see how we go. I mean, I guess you mentioned the Lotte Reiniger one. We perhaps could start there, because I think that's an interesting example of exactly what you're talking about in terms of a figure whose role in advertising is both really important to their overall body of work, and yet is perhaps something that we're in danger of neglecting. And certainly we've mentioned Reiniger and done an episode on Reiniger in the past, where we talked about the feature length, the Prince Ahmed, and I don't think the subject of advertising, if it did come up, it came up as an afterthought. So I think perhaps we in turn are part of that process. So I mean, I'm conscious listeners won't necessarily have this at their fingertips, but we'll probably put links to these on the website if people want to watch along with us. But for the sake of listeners, Malcolm, could you just give us a quick synopsis of sort of what this advert is, what happens in it, and what's interesting about it, and we'll go from there.
Of course, yeah. So the Lotte Reiniger example's from the early 1950s. It's an example of her work for the GPO, the General Post Office in the UK. So there's one interesting thing, that she's an emigre filmmaker who came to Britain from Germany, and the international exchange that happens in advertising is key there. It's in her typical silhouette cutout style, which people will know if they've seen Prince Ahmed or other films, but equally has been quite influential on things more recently, like the Harry Potter. That sequence has that silhouette style. It features a story about Father Christmas is kind of going on strike because everyone was late last year posting their letters. But this year, everybody knows that the last posting dates for Christmas, and therefore Father Christmas is happy and decides to carry on, and Christmas is saved through this. So the message here is a simple one about behavior more than a product, that it's promoting people to post early for Christmas, but also then has some other qualities to it, enhancing the brand, if you like, of the GPO. Although it's a government agency, it wants people to feel good about something that in other respects is just this very mundane functional thing. I guess that one of the things I wanted to talk about with it is the idea of craft, and that at Christmas especially, people want to hold on to a sense of the homemade. That's something that's been discussed with Reiniger a lot. Tashi Petter and Caroline Ruddle have done lots of work recently on Reiniger and craft. The idea of craft is something central to her work. And that's something we think about at Christmas a lot. You know, people might consume mass-produced goods at other times of year, but everybody wants to make things at this time of year. And just the act of writing Christmas cards. I mean, most people don't send post very much anymore, but it's still something we do today, writing Christmas cards. And so Reiniger's style, that hand cut silhouette, hand manipulated process, connects with these ideas about craft, the homemade, the homely tradition that are being communicated through the advert.
Well, it's funny because as you were talking, I looked up homemade Christmas gifts, and I was thinking obviously about the particular climate that we're in at the moment, and the accessibility that people have to going out to the shops and so forth. And I remember a sort of wave of programs every Christmas, as you say, that talk about giving something that's a little bit more sort of bespoke, from handmade rugs and kind of wallets to wearable blankets and fruit gin and all that sort of stuff. People that are just sort of making their own sort of stuff. But it's also interesting that out of all of the Christmas adverts that you sent over, I think perhaps the Hershey's one, although less so, which we'll come to, it's sort of the least Christmassy insofar as, thinking of color palettes, because it is all silhouette animation. It is these really intricate and ornate backlit figures that Reiniger, as you said, traditionally works with, and yet there is a sense of Christmas through the decorative nature of the images that you see. It's not colourful, and it's not sort of, I guess, magical in the traditional sense, but there's something about I wrote down I put based in the North Pole ? And then because I was trying to think about, because it's very difficult with a lot of the silhouette films to get a sense of place and space. You don't have your traditional establishing shot and then your analytical editing that goes in, like it's all on sort of one plane, both in the way that it's received and ultimately the way it's sort of produced. What struck me about it was what it seemed to be the most actually informative, i.e. it's giving you information about the last postal dates in a way that some of the other adverts I was thinking, I don't know anything about Hershey's here or Cartier, but there was something quite sort of informational about that, and perhaps ties into your broader work on useful animation. And then I was thinking, obviously, John Grierson's GPO and his traditions in documentary filmmaking versus this animated fantasy. So I was really struck and wasn't expecting it to see. I'd sort of forgotten. I knew that Reiniger worked on adverts, but hadn't really thought that she'd made a kind of Christmas themed one. But yeah, I thought it was great and very true to her style, and would fit really nicely in a discussion. And actually, I think bears out exactly your point about how and why we should consider these kinds of adverts as part of a filmmaker's work, and as a body of work, and as a way of thinking about their authorship as it moves across different media forms. There's absolutely no reason, as you say, from Tashi Petter's work and Caroline Ruddle's work, the way we can recontextualize Reiniger and actually her use of fairy tales, presumably, as actually present in things that are perhaps forgotten. And actually, I was wondering, is this because adverts are not accessible in the same way? I mean, I don't know whether this is something you've come across in your own work, but when we're talking about Reiniger's adverts, or we're talking about Pixar's adverts, is it just that they're not accessible? Or have they sort of slipped through the cracks there, or are they just available and people aren't really talking about them? Because this one in particular seemed really close to what Reiniger was doing as part of her style in other kind of contexts.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely archival issues about these films don't get preserved. Obviously, authorship-wise, who do they belong to? In lots of cases, there's multiple parties involved. It's not just an artist. It's also perhaps an advertising studio, and it's also a brand that's being advertised. So there's lots of practical questions about who owns these films, and then archives tend to follow history. So the choices archives make in terms of preservation and so on are often rooted in the history that we have. And the history we have currently says advertising is not important. So archives make choices based on the histories we have, and that's a good reason to rewrite the histories we have, and go and discover these films, because these films don't get preserved in the same way, and they get forgotten, and even though they're important. On a broader point that you were asking there, Chris, I think there's some interesting tensions here between historical and cultural specificity. There's the timelessness of this advert in one sense, that it's trying to talk to that fairy tale tradition. It's trying to speak to a timelessness. But in the other sense, of course, today, when we have emails and everything, it looks very of its time in another way. And likewise, it seems, on the one hand, rooted in British culture, in a British institution, in the GPO, and everybody, Father Christmas has a British accent. So it seems very, very British. But of course, Reiniger, as an emigre filmmaker, was crossing borders, and lots of the adverts we have here are all about crossing borders and becoming more global marketplace. And therefore, there's some tensions at work there about, is this rooted in a particular time and place, or are these crossing borders and changing as they do so?
The only thing I'd add is the on the note of crossing borders and the idea of being of its time, is that what it made me think of, sort of in terms of histories of fantasy cinema, is I think you could argue similarly, as much as it needs to be placed within the context of Reiniger's career. There's a relatively famous article by a scholar named Peter Valenti on a subgenre of fantasy filmmaking that was particularly prevalent sort of post Second World War up until about the early 1950s. That he calls the film blanc, which is a deliberate pun on the film noir, and it's a sort of the opposite, sort of like the light side of the film noir at exactly the same period. And he's talking about films like It's a Wonderful Life, Angel on My Shoulder, in the British context, A Matter of Life and Death, these movies that put characters in dialogue with a quasi-supernatural, quasi-folkloric, but also quasi-Judeo-Christian iconography and appease a worldview that's been very traumatized by the spectre of sort of the Second World War and the mortality rates and all this sort of stuff, where don't worry, there are forces at work in the world and they are good and benevolent and kind. And it's sort of, as much as the film noir is tapping into the anxiety of this era, the film Blanc is tapping into the sort of optimism or the desire for a reconciliation of this era, and it just made me think this is an example of a film Blanc. It's we've got Santa chatting with St. Peter as he does, running around, and its role is to take something like the post service and enchant it. And make you feel like taking part in something as simple as sending letters on time makes the world a better place. So it's fulfilling that function as well. So I think, histories of fantasy could do well to look to advertising, because we have here a fantastical short movie that does exactly all the things that other feature-length films are doing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's making the GPO the equivalent of Father Christmas, as you say, a benevolent force, even though in many respects, if we're thinking about Britain's imperial history and what's happening, it's a product both of the empire and of increasing global capitalism. So Reiniger, and that might be another reason why these films get ignored, because it's really hard to completely love a film that's selling those things. Sure. Imperialism, capitalism, these are things that we certainly within academia and artists are reluctant to be associated with. And especially Reiniger, who's someone who was obviously an emigre filmmaker because she had to leave Germany, and she was, she had to leave Britain as well because during the war, as a German citizen, she was still considered sort of an illegal alien. It's not a neat history. It's a lovable cartoon, and it's got this nice cozy feeling to it, but underlying it is some quite disturbing things that come to a head in the 1950s post-war.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that the film is fulfilling a cultural function that and you're right about that. I've got one of these films which I have a particular sort of dislike for exactly that reason of like, how can I admire the artistry when it's ultimately serving this sort of massive corporate cynical cause? But I think also I think it's important, and what your work does nicely is it complicates that distinction between, of course, I'm a scholar of Hollywood cinema. It's not like I write about countercultural avant-garde radical movies. I write about movies that are essentially doing exactly the same thing. It's just their product is the thing itself rather than another product, but it's still entrenched within all those power structures that you highlight there, Malcolm. So it's a useful complication to make.
But one positive we can maybe draw is here. This is a female filmmaker, and maybe advertising, because it's subordinated, was a space in which women often could find a role where they weren't allowed in other areas. So if we're trying to provide a slightly more positive aspect of it, that is one, which is, if we're rewriting this history, it partly provides a space for us to find more female filmmakers who weren't allowed to direct Disney films, but were able to work in advertising because it didn't have that cachet. And Jane Gaines has talked about that early cinema has got a lot more female filmmakers because it was seen as unimportant, uneconomic, or it hadn't developed yet. And I think there's a good argument that advertising is the same, that people who weren't allowed space in the mainstream industry can find a space in advertising. So perhaps there's a more positive way of thinking about those things too.
Yeah, I mean the narrative, or the dual narrative of margins and mainstream seems to obviously run right through animation anyway. You know, that it was sort of marginal and has since been sort of perhaps centered in a particular kind of way. I guess what struck me about the Reiniger advert was actually thinking about what Christmas adverts do more broadly, is that they sell an object or an item or a product or a commodity, and that's part of their value at Christmas time. Prices go up, you know, the shops not keeping Christmas quiet from about October onwards, all that sort of stuff. But it struck me that Reiniger's film advert does a really good job of sort of selling the feeling of Christmas, the emotion of Christmas, and this is something that runs through a lot of them. And I was doing a bit of research into one of the adverts, which will remain nameless, but that it's rooted in a sort of the brand intent is thoughtful giving. That's what but actually what it does is that it what connects up a lot of these adverts is that it's selling sentimentality, or it's selling a feeling that you only get at a particular time of year, and the emotion of that, and it comes from the sound and then the use of kind of carols that you only hear at a particular time of year. And some of the adverts that you sent over do have a sort of turn. Some are particularly strange adverts, and I do want to talk about one of them in particular, because I was like, I don't really see how this is a Christmas advert, and I think we all know which one I'm talking about. But there was something about it conjuring up the magical, and like Alex was saying about the idea of enchantment, I think that runs through Reiniger's. It's only a minute long, but at the same time as it gives all this information about letters and parcels and when they need to be sent, it kind of conjures up this image of frivolity and fun and sort of jolliness and emotion, and it really sells in a short space of time and through quite intricate but block silhouettes sells us an emotion, and I really liked that in a way that some of the others tried to do but didn't quite. And I wondered whether the pared down silhouette style, at the risk of not taking anything away from the skill, but the pared down style and the element of craft gives it something that the other adverts sort of don't have in their pristine digital illusionism. But yeah, I really liked it, and it's sort of, as I was watching it, I thought this is immediately going onto a syllabus somewhere.
Should we, in the spirit of time, we should probably move on to one of our next choices. In fact, why not, seeing as Chris just evoked pristine digital illusionism, jump to the Cartier. Cartier? I mean, this is actually a brand I've never heard of, which probably speaks to my lack of wearing a watch since the age of 8. But the Cartier advert, which I suspect is the one you were just referring to, Chris, about not feeling particularly Christmassy, and it seems to involve a leopard or a tiger transforming in various capacities. Malcolm, do you want to just give us a quick description of this advert and why you picked it?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not a Cartier consumer either. I'm not that rich. It's a high-end luxury goods brand. So if you go to any airport or any Park Avenue shopping place, that's where you'll see this brand. So it does contrast very strongly with the last one in that respect. To describe the ad, it's computer generated, photoreal panther. We can come back to why it's a panther going through both.
Yes, please, because I put digital leopard ? Generated by a spark. That's all I've got. That is all I've got. So Carry on.
All right, we'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that later. Yes, carry on. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, the digital panther runs through New York and then Paris, followed by both a kind of mystical shadow panther and these what do you call them, little sparks, the kind of digital effects that don't have any real name and don't have any existence in our world but seem magical. The crackle, they have it in comic book terms, but it's not crackle here in the same way. The reason for choosing, so number one, the panther is interesting because that's the kind of brand icon for Cartier. They're famous for certain brooches and jewelry that features that panther. So when we're thinking about animation, we often think about anthropomorphism, and so there's this natural desire to bring alive a product in any way, to give it personality, and clearly jewelry has no real function as such. It is essentially decorative. It is non-useful, and that's perhaps something interesting in and of itself. But the fact that Cartier have then anthropomorphized that, or it's created an animal character to sell their products and to make people feel a connection to it, while also very clearly signaling this is high end. It doesn't have a brand name on it, but anyone who's in the know, and you two obviously aren't in the know, knows this is a very expensive item. If you see a Cartier panther, you know this has cost someone a lot of money, and it's about that visible, conspicuous consumption. That's the opposite of the craft and the sort of family feelings that we maybe had with the Lotte Reiniger advert. So I think that was the key reason for choosing it. Is animation is often the go-to choice for advertisers because it can bring a product to life. It can give it a personality in a way that no other form can do. For Cartier, they've already done that in their product itself, so it's then natural to extend it into an animated version of that character. It's very different from a cartoon spokes character in one sense, and we'll see sort of examples of cartoon characters acting as spokespeople for products later. But in another sense, they're exactly the same. They're aimed at different market segments, but they're doing the same thing, which is animation brings things to life. If that's animation 101, if we can bring a product to life, people want it, and therefore they will buy it, even if it's a £25,000 brooch.
I certainly got a sense of the in terms of the visual detail in the advert. The fact is that I watched this one, I think, before the Reiniger one in the list that you sent, and the digital lushness of the shots, the shift in scale, the visual replication of the sort of panther come leopard thing, both two different ways of representing. So a sort of photoreal leopard or panther, and then a sort of essentially a shot of a panther that it looks like the earlier version of the real photoreal one, i.e. a sort of digital wireframe model. And the advert, I had to watch it a couple of times to get a sense of sort of narrative. And actually, again, that's one of the reasons why I like the Reiniger one, because it had a really nice self-enclosed little narrative, and a couple of the other ones too. This one I was trying to get a sense of, okay, this sort of red spark, this mystical like will-o'-the-wisp thing, that kind of comes down and is tried to grasp. It's playing with cat's inability to chase light and stuff like that, and I quite like that. And then it sort of morphs into this sort of mirror image of this panther, so that there are two digital panthers looking at each other, and then it kind of just goes berserk, and you have the camera moving in different places. You have these sort of really lush and detailed skylines, and the way that the spark flies across the night sky. I sort of, it was one of those adverts where you get to the end and go, what is this? Oh yeah, it's for that. And then it tells you at the end. I felt like with the title, I think the title of it is Winter's Tale or Winter Tale. And I felt like they came to that at the end. They did the advert and went, we need something kind of Christmassy. So yeah, we'll call it Winter Tale, and that'll be fine. But it looked fantastic, and it was obviously the lushness of the product is well matched to the digital illusion that's being presented here. But Yeah, it was sort of chalk and cheese if we're comparing it to the silhouette animation of Reiniger. I don't know, with Alex's fantasy hat on, I know he loves a bit of anthropomorphism, so I'll defer to him.
Well, you love a bit of anthropomorphism, Chris. I just follow you along for the ride a bit. But I mean, I think it's I don't know, as an animation, as the non-animation expert here, it's the only one that sort of declared to me quite obviously at its sort of CGI-ness, and there was a certain pristine quality. So I don't know that you could have a clunky go at trying to match the brand that you're articulating there, Malcolm, with the choice of technology. I think there's perhaps an interesting conversation to be had about the relationship between like animation as perceived as a costly, expensive technology paired with some of the luxury that brands seem to produce. Because there's one coming up, obviously, that has a certain high-end luxury quality that seems to be almost trying to use... Basically, there seems to be an implicit undercurrent behind some of these adverts, which is, look how much we've spent on this advert. We must be making loads of money. Our product must be really good, and you must need, that's all part of the sort of legitimization that a lot of advertisement can do. That you can trust us. We know what we're doing. Look how much we've spent on this thing to advertise to you. So I mean, it struck me of that, and I know what you mean, Chris. I think actually formally the thing's quite radical in its own way. I mean, completely divorced of context, because context there's not anything particularly radical about it, but the way the film is playing with sort of a narrative that is so overtly fantastical that it almost reminds me of what Todd McGowan's calls the cinema of fantasy, which is sort of this like a type of cinema he theorizes as being a cinema that sort of demonstrates to the viewer the fecundity and sort of obliqueness and fragile nature of one's own ability to fantasize, and that you constantly spend your life fantasizing, thinking that if you could only get these things, that would be it. But actually, fantasy is ghostly and primal and energy alone, and that's sort of demonstrated in this clip. There's a sense that there's no sense to communicate that what you need in life is a watch. There's just a sort of abundance of fantasy without any target or purpose or direction towards it. It's just there on screen. So I was kind of struck by it. I think it's the most formally odd and confusing and interesting to watch, devoid of all context and all that sort of stuff as well, though. So it's an interesting choice. So it's a Christmas advert then, so it was released during the Christmas period. Why is there something about different brands choosing to lean into or out of Christmas?
Well, I mean, there's some basic stuff here, which is, as I say, it shows New York and Paris and the high-end shopping streets in those two cities, which would obviously be very busy at this time of year ordinarily. And they're going for the market of, I guess this is gendered, but people buying these very expensive high-end goods for their partners, lovers, what have you. So there is clearly some basic function still going on here. There's no advert in which it's completely intangible, but it's all about the intangible and what you were talking about, Alex. I feel like the idea of buying a Cartier item is not that it has any function. You can buy I'm a swatch man, you can buy a £30 swatch and it'll tell you the time very accurately. You don't need a £5,000 watch to tell the time accurately. And even more so, one of those leopard brooches is purely decorative. It has, nobody wears cloaks that need holding together with a pin anymore. It's purely conspicuous consumption and an attachment to the brand ideals that are entirely intangible. And so that intangibility of CGI, and especially, as you say, that capacity of these strange wispy lights, and then the total lack of adherence to any coherent space makes it very appealing to have CGI doing this, because it's saying not only is it's expensive, you can feel the money on screen here, but also that you can get a sense of a quality, an emotion, a feeling that you get by buying one of these, or they want you to feel when you get one of these products. It goes way beyond its function, its use value, if we're thinking in Marxist terms. Equally, of course, it does show this spatial jump from New York to Paris seems interesting. It's probably the only ad that's not English language. There's no language in it, but Cartier being a sort of French brand name. And how are we thinking about the shift to globalization? If the Lotte Reiniger film from 1950s was rooted in a specific country and could not be exported, the posting dates somewhere else it's just not that meaningful. Here we've got the idea of these global brands that don't live in any particular country anymore and sit outside of it. And so maybe that ineffable quality of that CGI also is an apt way of communicating the ineffability of multinational conglomerates that control our world, but don't seem to have any place anymore. They exist outside of space in one sense. So that seems really interesting to me in this advert.
I absolutely agree, and I think the playing it on silent, you'd be forgiven for perhaps thinking it was an advert about like phone signal, because I was thinking about the idea of not a network culture and reach, and also this idea. I'm kind of fascinated by Alex's point about it's been 60 odd episodes, and I'm fascinated by a point that Alex has made, but it's happened.
Yes!
So CG's perceived worth as a visual medium, this idea that CG kind of just is expensive, and obviously this is then concentrated at Christmas when we think about the and I was thinking actually about event television and event cinema and the digital productions relationship to event cinema, and how this is, here we go, the countdown to the premiere of a particular Christmas advert, which is certainly true of a couple of the ones that we'll end up looking at, and one in particular. In this sort of case, absolutely the sort of reach and the digital prestige and the sort of the money on screen, and I find that kind of really interesting. There's something definitely about this advert that is matching the prestige and the luxury of the product with that sort of expensive and perceived worth of a digital technology that's kind of intangible but everywhere, like the internet, and we're all sort of kind of connected. It kind of looked like a Vodafone advert. If we're going to go full out and advertise brands on this podcast, which apparently we are now.
Hi everyone, just pausing the podcast to thank everyone for their contributions to these listener choice episodes. We've been featuring these once a month over the past few months of the year, and it's been a real delight to hear your suggestions and be pushed into thinking about new types of fantasy animation that perhaps we wouldn't have considered doing, and exploring new avenues of popular media with you all. So thanks very much for your suggestions.
Absolutely. And for our special Christmas episode, the winning vote went to Sarah Wingrove, who sort of allowed us to think about Christmas and fantasy and animation in a slightly different way. So for our listener's choice, we asked you to sort of think about your favourite kind of fantasy animation Christmas special, what we should discuss on the podcast. And Sarah Wingrove suggested the kinds of animation that is featured on advertising. So Christmas advert, Sainsbury's, M&S, John Lewis. So thank you, Sarah. It's given us a real sort of way of thinking about, I think, fantasy and animation during this festive period.
A few honourable mentions, thanks to Bella Honus Rowe, who has simply written Arthur Christmas, obviously, and I think she's saying obviously because Bella is obviously the editor of Aardman Animations Beyond Stop Motion, a wonderful academic collection of essays about Aardman, featuring stuff on Arthur Christmas. I think there are two really rather good essays in there by me and you, Chris, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, well, I sort of had a similar thought. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great collection. So thank you, Bella, for that sort of suggestion. Another honourable mention goes to Vincent M. Gain, who gave us the suggestion of Klaus. So Klaus, very popular 2D Christmas animated special that premiered on Netflix a year ago. A really popular one, and hopefully, I think that was a close thing. It was the first animated film from Netflix to be nominated for an Academy Award, which is rare both for animation and for Christmas themed animations as well. So thank you, Vincent, for that suggestion.
And then finally, we had a suggestion from Toby Jungius, who is the co-host of a fan podcast called the New Century Book Series, where he chats about movies and games and stop-motion animation. And he's, went down a rabbit hole of various Rankin and Bass versions of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, including the 1964 classic, but also some follow-ups and sequels of which went into, in his words, strange places. And whilst we would have loved to have gone down those strange places, I think that might have to wait for another year. But thank you, everybody. And thank all for your continued listenership and encouragement. It's wonderful chatting you all, and the conversations will flow on until 2021. You can follow us via our various social media streams at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research, as well as fantasy-animation.org. We're going to take a quick break at the end of this podcast just for our 2-week Christmas break. We'll be back in early January, and we've already got a few episodes in the can ready to release, and there's some doozies out there, so we're excited to share with you in 2021 and continue these conversations we're having. It's been really exciting.
But for now, let's get back to the show, and Merry Christmas.
I think to keep the pace going, let's move on to another one, but I think it pairs nicely with what we've just been talking about in terms of the relationship between brand, a sense of luxury, a sense of expense, the advert as events. Hopefully you guys know where I'm going with this, which is the John Lewis advert. What's it called? The Bear and the
Hare.
Bear and the Hare. I mean, so this is where I'm going to get the hate mail this week, because this is my least favourite by a country mile. It always has been. I knew it was going to be going into it, but fine. Malcolm, if for those who don't know, perhaps our non-UK listeners, what is the Bear and the Hare all about?
So, for international listeners, John Lewis Partnership and Waitrose are big high street shops, department store and supermarket. We can come back to their corporate organization in a minute, hopefully. Each year, for quite a few years now, they've had this trend of making an animated or semi-animated advert that becomes a big event, a big PR stunt that towards the end of November, they can launch the ad to the world, having kept it under wraps, generate loads of free PR and social media shares, as well as actually paying for airtime on TV and on the web. And they've very commonly done this with animation, which I think is really interesting. In this case, it's the backgrounds are CGI, I think, but the main characters are all anthropomorphized animal characters in a Disney tradition. They've kept the hand-drawn quality like those later Disney films like 101 Dalmatians, where rather than cleaning it up extensively, you still get that real sense of the jittery outlines of the hand-drawn quality. It's all about character animation and getting a sense of these animals. The story is that the bear misses Christmas every year because he's hibernating, of course. That's his nature, his need. But the hare is there to help organize Christmas. And this year, they get the bear an alarm clock, spoiler alert, which wakes him up at Christmas time so he can come out at Christmas Day and join all the other animals. There's a lot of weird things. I can get why Alex wouldn't like this, because there's some really weird stuff. And like anything that has animals in it, you're always thinking about anthropomorphism, the way we think about animals. These aren't really animals in any meaningful sense here. They're humans in different shapes. But the reason I chose it, the main thing I wanted to do beyond, we had to talk about John Lewis, because they've, it's investing in the animation industry. There's lots of animators in this country who would, spend the whole year working on a John Lewis ad. This year, they kind of spread the work around multiple groups. And I think that's what's interesting about this is the idea of collectivity is central to this, that it's not just the bear and hare. There's also all the other animals in the forest gather around this Christmas tree. So from John Lewis's point of view, it's about Christmas is the time of coming together and community, and they're trying to latch on to that with their brand. And animation's the ideal form for that because it's a communal activity. We don't have a star here. Other TV ads, Christmas ads, will hire a famous person and get them to be the spokesperson for it. Here, it's all about the collective, which it's about the collectivity of Christmas and everyone coming together. It's about the fact that animation is a collective process. This is hugely labor-intensive advert that requires lots of people to work on it, and that John Lewis and Waitrose are collectively owned by the partners that work there. So rather than being stock exchange listed, Waitrose, John Lewis are a collective company. Of course, they're still there to make a profit, and they're still part of corporate capitalist process in one sense, but in another sense, one of their differences is that collective ownership. And so that at least the intent of this ad is to create this synergy between those different qualities. And it's not about selling a product. So, we'll see some other ads which are very much about the product, the commodity. Here, it's about the brand and giving us that quality. And the quality here is, I would say, collectivity is the key word.
Yeah, I mean, I have. It's the one. Funny enough, it's the one that I had the most notes on. But actually, I think that was a symptom of the fact that there is a lot written on these adverts and John Lewis adverts, as you say, this sort of event television. And when you're doing a bit of research into yes, I kind of get the narrative. I kind of quite like the narrative of it. I was intrigued by the background. So at first I thought it was CG backgrounds, but then I was reading about that there were 3D sets that were built at Shepperton by John Lee, who worked on Frankenweenie. And then I thought, okay, so maybe some of it is sort of a hybrid in lots and lots of ways. You have sort of CG backgrounds, but potentially with stop motion sets, in addition to an environment or characters that are 2D. I totally buy the emotional reaction in its relationship to character animation. What's interesting about both the Bear and the Hare is that they both have Twitter accounts, and they will be tagged in this advert come Monday morning, which I thought was interesting and also harrowing, and 5,000 people follow them. It's obviously John Lewis, as you said, Malcolm, has form with regards to these Christmas mini movies. It's all about, and when I said earlier about the brand identity of sort of thoughtful giving, I think that was the brief that John Lewis gave the animators. Animators made up from a London-based studio, Blink Inc., alongside a New York and LA company as well. And also, I was interested that the traditional animation was led by the director or the co-director of Brother Bear, Aaron Blaise. So Disney's 2000 and I think it's 2003, 2004, that kind of time. So Disney's sort of post. I guess it's interesting within Disney history because it's like the penultimate film before Disney moved to CGI. You have Brother Bear, I think, and then you have Home on the Range, and then Disney moved to CGI with Chicken Little. So those sorts of just pre-digital Disney films tend to get forgotten because they're not the anarchic Emperor's New Groove that we've obviously talked about in a previous episode, and they're not the studio's seismic shift to digital. They're sort of like the last two where apparently influence is waning, they're creatively stagnant, all that kind of energy is lacking from the studio, and then they get plugged into CGI and they're away. So, but I thought it was interesting that kind of the co-director of Brother Bear, and also worked on The Lion King and many others, which were obviously particularly renowned for their anthropomorphic casts. Aaron Blaise, his work on this, I'd love to do a bit more research into what his role on the advert was. But yeah, I mean, it looks great and is very luscious, and the music is very evocative, and the shift between scenes, it's very sentimental. It's pushing buttons. It's doing all the right thing. It kind of does what a Christmas advert should do, but there is always that sort of, yeah, what am I? It's like, someone getting your wallet, wrapping it up, and going, just take the money out of that, whatever I spent on you. There's something about it which I couldn't kind of get past, but Alex is looking at me like he's about to get all the hate mail again.
No, I'm not. I mean, I hadn't considered the relationship between the narrative of sort of collectivism and the corporate structure of John Lewis. Actually, that hadn't struck me, and you're absolutely right, Malcolm. And it's something to think about because that does complicate the kind of cynical attitude I have to it, which is just because I live in the UK and every year we get bombarded by this advert, and lots of people seem to think it's the greatest artistic sort of moment of the year, and I have the typically academic response and sort of wish to draw my attention elsewhere to other things. But I think, we've already talked about why perhaps that in itself is quite a simplistic thing to do. So, to try and be productive about it, I think there's an interesting equation here, because I think the Disney analogy is fair. I think we've all made it now, and there's something about the idea that what John Lewis have done is managed to recapture or create a Disney movie, the likes of which isn't made anymore. And I think it's very much firmly selling to a certain age demographic who are nostalgic for a certain kind of animation. And so what they seem to be doing is sort of positioning themselves as the sort of reclaimers of a certain kind of almost, I guess, lost childhood. And there's something interesting about Christmas and the relationship between children and the relationship between children and fantasy. And that, obviously what a lot of what Christmas is a sort of cultural infantilization, not in a necessarily pejorative way, but certainly you spend a lot of time constructing a society to appeal more to children, from Santa's grottos to leaving mince pies out, to John Lewis adverts. So there's a certain sense that, and it's quite odd that it's obviously a lost childhood rather than children, because there's absolutely no way any child in their right mind would want to spend any time in a John Lewis department store, because it's not like it's full of soft play and fun. It's full of iPads and couches and those kinds of things.
No, that's a really interesting idea, isn't it? I hadn't really been thinking about this, but yes, the fantasy of childhood rather than actual childhood. So I don't know which advert you're going to go to next, but there is an advert here that is very obviously for children, selling a product that children will consume more than anything. And this John Lewis advert's not for kids. No child wants to watch this John Lewis advert, even though it seems to be both about Christmas, which is meant to be all for kids, and it's animation, which, as we all know, has often been stereotyped as being all for kids. This ad's neither of them, even though it rests on that fantasy of childhood.
Was the advert you were referring to prehistoric or Arctic in its flavour?
Yeah, prehistoric, although both probably.
Sure. Sure. Let's go there then.
Right. So this is a advert for American cereal. This is very much an American advert and an American product. Cocoa Pebbles, which is a high fructose corn syrup containing American cereal, being advertised.
Aren't they all? Aren't they all? Aren't they all?
Being advertised by the Flintstones. This is from 1985, but in some respects I chose it because it speaks to another neglected history of animation, which is television animation, intersects with advertising importantly here. So to describe the ad, Fred is asleep at Christmas. He's not sharing his Cocoa Pebbles with the kids, and the ghost of Christmas past in Barney's form comes in to warn him that if he doesn't change his ways, he's going to end up the same way as Scrooge. And of course, Fred then corrects his ways and shares his sugary cereal. So the ad's from the mid-'80s. It's not a masterpiece by any means, but it's, to me, what was interesting is the Flintstones and all those 1960s TV animation were driven by advertising in the most basic sense, that TV was free to view, depended entirely on advertising for its income. The Flintstones was a primetime show initially, and charged a fair amount because it had high viewers and a whole family audience, but then transfers to Saturday morning TV, which is when, I think, as Jason Mattel talks about, that's when animation gets that childish association in many respects, because these low-cost, made-for-TV, Hanna-Barbera, Filmation type TV cartoons being shown on Saturday mornings when parents are still in bed, kids get up and watch it, and of course eat cereal. So the advertising was much cheaper during these Saturday morning TV shows, and selling products that genuinely kids want and selling them in a way that kids want. So there's this sort of mutual relationship between advertising and animation here, that huge swathes of animation history would not exist without advertising, in the most basic sense that TV wouldn't work economically without advertising. And then you're making adverts that appeal to kids who are watching these particular shows, and making shows that will appeal to kids so that advertisers buy time during them. So there's trying to distinguish which came first, animation or advertising of this kind here, is impossible. The two things are fused completely. Without one, you wouldn't have the other. So a big chunk of animation history, and clearly this then runs into He-Man and She-Ra in the 80s, and the mutual relationship between kids advertising and kids animation.
I had a question actually that I don't know if you know the answer to. So was this produced by, because when we talk about animation history, as we often do, and certainly on this podcast we've talked about a number of studios, and I remember episodes where we've talked about limited animation style and UPA's sort of modernist graphic design of its characters, and I think the Mattel book that you're talking about also discusses Hanna-Barbera's, again, a similar kind of pared down visual style, perhaps dialogue heavy, I guess, sound effects. Was this advert produced by Hanna-Barbera? Literally the kind of these are producing these... Because I'm just thinking about, this is the first advert that we've looked at that is taking a recognizable media product or a set of characters and and theming them. And actually, I remember... I think this is true of Ewan Kirkland's writing on like the Minions, where he talks about their themability, because they're kind of blank characters that can be themed and therefore made adaptable to various sorts of holidays. And you get like the Halloween Minions and the Christmas Minions and that sort of stuff. It seemed like this is the first instance where we're sort of getting a theming of characters, of prehistoric characters. But is this did Hanna-Barbera produce this advert, and it was just they produced an advert for, or the studio produced an advert for this serial, or yeah, because it sort of really struck me as why are the Flintstones selling out themselves like this?
Well, the Flintstones were selling cigarettes. If you go and Google Flintstones cigarette ads, it's not a Christmas ad, so I couldn't include that. But in many ways, I'd rather talk about what are the Flintstones doing smoking here. I don't know who produced this ad, actually. I haven't done the full history here. It was more indicative of a bigger trend, which is, I think this serial is kind of a spin-off of the Flintstones. So what you have is this very complex corporate exchange. I mean, we talk lots about transmedia nowadays, and that we're normally talking about Marvel or, comic book interactions. But this is one of these transmedia franchises here, the Flintstones. The Flintstones was the first point, a mainstream primetime animated show. But then they start making products with those characters on them, and then those characters start advertising those products, and we've got this exchange. I mean, the Flintstones was always had this sort of satirization of consumer culture. Of course, it's kind of 1960s. They had all the mod cons in their house, but they kind of have that novelty prehistoric tweak to them. But here they're, as you say, shilling for the man very much here. And also it's by the 1980s, the Flintstones are just a corporate franchise for hire. Disney won't sell you their characters to sell anything that isn't a Disney product. They're walled off. Warner Brothers are a bit more selective. These kind of lower down the animation food chain characters, you can stick them on anything. You pay your license fee, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't make for a great ad. And the advert's got this weird use of 3D at one point in it, like CGI. It must be early CGI, I guess, in it. That just speaks to the kind of mundane reality of what animation is often doing, which is this appeals to kids. The product is a sugary product that kids watch when they're watching Saturday morning TV. The Flintstones is kind of these characters that are cheaply produced. Of course, there's a value judgment about, Lotte Reiniger is like the high canon of animation history. But the Flintstones is a crucial part of animation history. It employed lots of people. It shaped the way people thought about animation for a long time. And we shouldn't ignore it just because this is no masterpiece.
Just before we get to the final two, actually, as you were talking and thinking about this assumption, actually, that transmedia is a contemporary phenomenon, when of course it's not, in exactly the way that you've described. The tendency is to think about it in relation to as distinct from multimedia, but also very much a digital phenomenon, or a digitally supported phenomenon. But actually, it got me thinking about the use of voices and star voices in something like this advert, and how, obviously, with contemporary computer animated films, often the star isn't voicing the computer game character version of, it's Jim Hanks rather than Tom Hanks, that kind of thing. It's Jim Hanks doing the voice of of Woody in pull string toys rather than Tom Hanks. It is Jay Farrow doing the voice of Eddie Murphy as the voice of the donkey in the Shrek video games. And I don't know this, but as I was listening to that advert, I couldn't quite make out whether it was the real Flintstones voices or what was happening there. But I suppose it speaks to a broader thing, as what you said earlier about the use of stars, and a lot of these adverts, Christmas adverts, don't perhaps tend towards stars, perhaps because we think of it as a time of family and collectivity, and so it seems, unless you're Elton John and you want to use the John Lewis advert to sell your biopic Rocket Man, but that's a separate conversation. But there is sort of something interesting about the use of star voices in something like these adverts, and whether or not they are part of the sort of canon because they use the same voice actors, or what they're sort of doing. I don't have an answer to it. I'd love to know a bit more about the extent to which that Flintstones advert did use the sort of real voice cast. But
just to add to that, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, I didn't create this mismatch much, but quite often that what also happens is this idea of like the transmedia effect of moving these characters outside their domain, often to a place where there's slightly more lo-fi production method, and the animation feels off or kind of uncannily it's them but not them, from everything from sort of the use of a film franchise in a televisual context, whereby suddenly the production values are downgraded a little bit, so the characters are sort of them but sort of not them, to something like the slightly ickily painted Mickey Mouse on the side of a nursery that haven't quite got the license and paid someone that clearly doesn't exactly work up the road at the Disney studio, but there's that weird cultural phenomenon, which I guess links to sort of ideas of of animation stardom, like David McGowan's work and stuff, like of seeing the star, seeing the animated character, but it not being quite the animated character, and that sort of uncanny valley that exists within. I'm not sure that's actually what's going on with the Flintstones, but I guess there's a certain, I don't know, canonized problem, which is like, sorry, hang on a minute, what are they doing now? Because shouldn't they be like entertaining us rather than selling? There's a sort of betrayal of the implicit contract going on in there, which is interesting. And the only other thing I would say about this one is just the only thing to highlight is, of course, it's riffing on Dickens's Christmas Carol, isn't it? Which we did the Muppets Christmas Carol this time last year. I'm sure it's not the last time we'll mention this thing, because it's so embedded within just sort of popular culture's understanding of fantasy Christmas narratives. From the obligatory sort of Mickey's Christmas Carol, we have a Flintstones Christmas Carol in advert form here, to even just things like It's a Wonderful Life, which are essentially riffing on it but doing different things. So it just goes to show how important that framework, that story is to our popular conceptions of what a Christmas story looks like, even in this animated form.
And it's a story that ends in consumption. I mean, that's the question. Dickens is a canny writer who always allows you two interpretations, one of which is this Christian ideal of sharing and coming together. The other is of consumption. And, we've got this big turkey that this Tiny Tim and Bob Cratchit were actually perfectly happy there. Scrooge is claiming he's come to save Christmas, bringing this big turkey to consume. But it's like, well, actually, is this the case? Maybe. So there's actually more of a connection here. There is also that duality, which animation especially was developing from the 80s onwards and becomes a big part of what, Sam Summers talks about with DreamWorks and things, is the dual audience. This is an advert for kids with the cereal and the silly voices and stuff, but the adults can still engage with this because of those cultural references that children might not get. But for the adults, they see this as sort of redeeming the advert in some way, making them feel clever by noticing the references.
I'm conscious of time, and we've got two left. I'm going to try and do an impossible task, perhaps, but they're both quite short, and they're both selling quite well-known products. So perhaps we could try and bunch them together into sort of a pairing, if you will. So we've got one that seems to be nominally selling Hershey's Kisses, I believe, which is a kind of confectionery. I'm aware of the peanut butter cups. I'm not quite sure I'm aware of the Kisses, but some sort of chocolate. And then, of course, we couldn't do the whole episode without mentioning a Coca-Cola advert. And you picked a particularly fine example, Malcolm, that I was saying just before we start recording, gave me a somewhat Proustian moment of recollection. So do you want to just sort of, if you can, bunch those two together and sum up why you've picked these particular ones? Because I'm sure both of these products have had a long history of doing Christmas advertisements. So
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, both of the adverts. So the Coca-Cola one is, I mean, I chose it because it's about the campaign. Both of these are really about the campaign, the way animation's not just independent of everything else. It's embedded in this wider process of the campaign that speaks to the intermediality of animation. But the Coca-Cola ad, there's the polar bears ads, which are a repeated thing. And then there is also the Christmas is coming ads, which is sort of looped in together. The Hershey's Bells ad I'd not seen before when I was sort of investigating, but apparently it's a big tradition, and tradition's the other aspect I wanted to raise here with both of these. Was the Hershey's ad apparently first showed in 1989 in America, and then every year is repeated, and it's become part of the Christmas traditions to have this same advert in which the little kisses, which also happen to look like little bells, are shaped like a Christmas tree, but ring a Christmas carol out. And so there's the key thing here is really repetition and tradition, the way in which we expect to see the Coca-Cola ads, whether it's those polar bears who are repeated on endlessly, or the Christmas is coming ad. And of course, Coca-Cola famously gave Father Christmas his current image. They didn't invent that character, of course, but the white beard and the red suit was something that was really popularized through their imagery and advertising. And the Hershey bells likewise is about tradition and repetition, and the fact that you're showing the same things over and over again. And that speaks to animation, I think. Again, if the question we want to ask, that I always want to ask, is why animation in these things? Yeah, it's an advert, it's selling stuff, of course. Maybe there's a connection with the brand, but particularly why animation? The idea of repetition is clearly something that's crucial to animation in its production process, in our consumption of repeated versions of it, and especially in this case where the same ads are recycled every year to build up a tradition that we become attached to, is perhaps crucial to these ads. Continuity, especially at Christmas, we want to feel connected to the past in some way, and animation does that in lots of ways, but especially in these versions.
But also this sort of seriality of Christmas. You know, we've all played the game as to when are we going to hear Mariah Carey, when are we going to hear Wham for the first time, and so that seriality is embedded within and kind of comes into collision with a Christmas period where we finally heard, you know, you're talking to somebody with the surname Holiday, and it would be remiss if I didn't start singing The Holidays Are Coming, which is what we used to sing when we went to visit relatives or whatever during the Christmas period. So, and we still have an ongoing kind of social media joke, me and my sister, is like, have you seen it yet? The first advert, etc. So the seriality of Christmas and the sort of the eventness of when does Christmas begin? Well, it doesn't begin in October when a shop starts selling Christmas baubles. It begins really when you start hearing a kind of corpus of songs. And equally, you know, we're at a particular period where certain kinds of Christmas songs by the Pogues and Kirsten MacColl are getting a bit of visibility because people have never heard of a radio edit. So there's lots and lots of those things about the seriality of Christmas that ties in quite nicely with what you're saying about about nostalgia, but also about the sort of the role of tradition. I was less familiar with the Hershey's, and it's, you know, it's very short, and I sort of looking at it. So it's bells ringing of their own volition, and then I just wrote, "We all want some figgy pudding?" ? So there was that, and the sort of sonic aspect of Christmas. So I was less familiar with Hershey's, mainly because I think the chocolate is disgusting. There, I've said it. But obviously Coca-Cola, polar bears. I noticed that the characters themselves first appeared in the 1920s, and that these are sort of regular sort of symbols for Coca-Cola. And then I found that in 2012 there was a short film starring those polar bears. So they've now made the leap to short film production. Good luck to them. So yeah, I mean, I thought it was great. You know, the advert that you showed had the date of 93, but you said it was first around in the 80s, which would kind of tally with CGI anyway. And I hadn't realised it was sort of a repeated advert, but obviously 93, Jurassic Park, 2 years before Toy Story, etc. So it would fit quite nicely with the use of CGI and what CGI looks like in those adverts as opposed to what it looked like on cinema screens at that particular time, and so I'm sort of interested in what CGI was doing on adverts and on television as opposed to the sort of spectacle of techno-futurism that it was sort of doing on screen. But yeah, I mean, I like them. I like them both. The Coca-Cola one felt more familiar to me in a way that the Hershey's one I sort of felt a little bit disconnected to. But yeah, don't like the chocolate either.
I have 2 points on them, which is that I think the Coca-Cola one did feel familiar to me because I hadn't thought about it for years, but I remember that one. I think I was probably quite young when I saw it for the first time. So it had that sort of resonance with me. And I think both of them, both the Hershey's and the Coca-Cola advert, demonstrate a sort of well, this is links to Chris's work actually, so that's annoying, but it lists to Chris's work on sort of, you know, animation's ability to sort of offer up anthropomorphic effective spaces in which we can inhabit. Because it's interesting, the Coca-Cola advert, of course, it's trying to normalize quite a peculiar activity, which is drinking Coca-Cola in the cold. And it does it by rooting us in the perspective of a polar bear discovering this magical Coca-Cola. And of course, that's exactly what you need to do in December when you're trying to sound Coca-Cola, because that's when you need people to be drinking it. So it's bizarre enough that Coca-Cola is associated with Christmas because, of course, I would have thought certainly my consumption of soft chilled drinks goes up in the summer, not in the winter. Likewise, ice cream and all this kind of stuff. So they're using anthropomorphic imagery to root you in a phenomenological experience they want you to have, which I think is really, really interesting. The bells also sort of make magical these quite mundane objects. And then the final thing I'll say is this idea of repetition. Of course, the other thing, to bring it back to what I said about an hour or so ago about desire, is that what is desire if not a repetitive act we repeat over and over again that brings energy and dynamism into our lives? How many times in my life have I desired a cheeseburger? And yet the next time I desire a cheeseburger, the desire will be felt, and perhaps even more felt, because I know I keep desiring cheeseburgers. My waistline certainly does anyway. So there's a certain interesting relationship between repetition, desire, fantasy, and animation that still is rooted in the sort of DNA of all these things that makes them really fascinating to talk about. I think we're probably at the end of our journey there, Malcolm. I mean, this is hard, but is there we're going to put all of these up on our website. So in the page for this podcast, you can find it and watch them at your leisure, listeners. Is there one or two you'd pick out or single out as particularly worth watching, or are they just recommend them all? If you want to sit on the fence.
I mean, none of them were chosen because they're masterpieces. Obviously, the Lotte Reiniger one is probably the one you feel like fits their chance of making the canon. It's one of the, a really crucial figure in animation history. It does have a lot of appealing qualities to it, although also the underlying things we talked about. I guess the other end of the scale, that Flintstones one, just because it's kind of horrible, really, and you've got to recognize, but it exists, and that's one of the things we do is advertising. We're not here to build a canon and find the great men of history here. We're here to identify how do we think about animation? How is it embedded in our lives? And if the Flintstones ad kind of tells you, we all know who the Flintstones are, and this is something that surrounds us the whole time, and that we need to notice that everyday quality as well as the unique ones. Whereas some of the others are intentionally trying to create a uniqueness or a difference or stand out. The Flintstones one's everyday, mundane, just as the product it's selling is. And we need to, I would like everyone, all our listeners here, to go, let's notice these adverts, whether they're when you're at the, out and about and they're on screens out in public, whether they're on your mobile phone, web ads, they're all animated adverts and they're ubiquitous everywhere around us. They're not only key to employing people in the animation industry, but they're so central to the way we look at the world now that we can't ignore them.
No, absolutely. And something that I think those of us who teach animation sort of try and impress on our students, as you say, the kind of cultural ubiquity of animation and how it's embedded into lots of different practices and on different platforms. I mean, for me, advertising has no influence on me whatsoever. So, and on that note, I'm going to go and drink Coca-Cola whilst eating Hershey's and a chocolate cereal while buying a Cartier watch from John Lewis in silhouette. So there we go.
Well, speaking of advertising, Malcolm, where can listeners find your book, and if they so wish to purchase it?
Animation and Advertising, edited by myself and Kirsten Thompson, containing lots of great, it's an edited collection, so it's got lots of great contributions, one from Mr. Christopher Holliday on Pixar's Adverts, one by Tasha Petter on Lotte Reiniger, lots of other great chapters by lots of other great scholars in there too. It's published by Palgrave as part of the Palgrave animation series that's edited by Paul Ward and Caroline Ruddle. Do check it out. And we hope to continue the conversation.
And you have a Twitter feed, right?
Yeah, there's a Animation and Advertising Twitter feed, and also myself. My handle's Malcolm Cook 76. The Animation and Advertising one's probably not well designed. I think it's Ad1 or something. But if you search for it, you'll find it.
Cool, terrific. I hope people check it out because it's a really worthwhile topic that needs continued conversation, as you say. Talking of continued conversation, we're going to take a very quick pause after this episode for a Christmas break. So we'll be back in early January, so only a few more weeks, but we'll be back soon. In the meantime, you can find us at Fan Anim Research on all our various social media handles, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit, as well as the website fantasy-animation.org, where you can access our podcasts, read previous blog posts, and continue to take part in the conversation. Malcolm, thanks so much for coming on the show. We've really appreciated you sharing some really both very well seen and some slightly more hidden examples from animation advertising history. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Chris, I guess I'll see you in the new year.
You will. 2020's been a strange one, but I'll see you in 2021.
Maybe in the same room at one point if
Yes.
if the months go by. But until then, listeners, have a great Christmas, Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2021. Goodbye.
Bye.
I walked across an empty land. I knew the pathway like the back